So, this isn't going to be like an extensive deep dive analysis on Stray Kids' songs on the themes of growing up and discovering one's own identity. This is just a few examples to help support my thesis in a way. So, anyway, I think a lot of us have had moments in our lives where even if we age 1 year, we can see the growth happen. Like over the year, I have felt myself grow up. And, the thing is that everyone knows that they're never done growing. Even when they do think they are, they truly are never not. Does that sentence make sense? I'm not sure. But, ever since January 2024, I've made a mental note of how I wanted to analyze my growth. And in 2025, I've noticed that difference. And I've noticed that all the events that happen that will always be inevitable, like Valentine's Day or Easter, I kind of use those holidays as a benchmark to see where I'm at and where I feel I can do better or reflect on how I've changed over time. Over the year, I felt a lot more hyper aware of my surroundings, whether that be the sky or the wind. I've noticed that I am picking up on how different and yet how the same everything is, whether that would be like a holiday, for example. I'm so aware of the fact that it's a holiday, but how minute the differences or how great the differences are from how we celebrate it from the previous year is such an interesting thing to analyze. For example, you've had a good memory that's attached to the sun setting. And that good memory obviously happened. And you remember how beautiful the sun was during that good memory and how the clouds looked, how the sky looked, and how the sun looked at the time. But then maybe like a year later, it's almost like the sky has found itself in that position again. And you use that moment to see how far you've come and how different life is or how similar life is. And, you start to be hyper aware of the fact that sometimes a sunset can simply be your benchmark of progress. Now, I think it's a good time to talk about the main topic of this video, and, that is Stray Kids. And, I found Stray Kids at a very transitional point in my life. And, even though I found the group during the Maxton era, or I guess when the era was ending, because I guess promotional eras end like weeks in K-pop. I'm not sure. But, I guess I found Maxton maybe way after it released. I don't know when it released. I'm so sorry. But, yeah. Even though I did fall in love with their music during the Maxton era, which I would, phrase as the modern Stray Kids era, because, again, I'm not going to list an album from 2022 as old. Because I don't want to break my own sense of time, because 2022 is still fairly recent. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, it's not like, that's why I still count it as like the modern era of Stray Kids, because I don't know, I don't think it's like that old. But anyway, I did some digging into their discography, and I found heavy themes of growing up and self-identity. And when I look back into their discography before God's Menu, there's something so grounded about it. You can tell that they did a lot of introspective work about how they wanted to express their feelings. And I've noticed that there's anxiety and fear, and yet there's a lot of curiosity during that point in their discography. And now, to be clear, I'm obsessed with their modern discography because their modern discography is what got me into the group. But I do feel like talking about their discography pre God's Menu, I think it does a lot of. I think it should be talked about more because it's extremely underrated, and I don't think it's as appreciated as. I think even their title tracks aren't as appreciated pre God's Menu. I think there's a need to talk about their pre God's Menu discography. Because I keep saying God's Menu because I feel like that song, that title track for the album, like, that was a catalyst for so many things that are currently happening in terms of success and how their modern discography looks like now. I mean, in terms of their title tracks, that is. So, even though they do have this image, this quote-unquote noise music image, I do feel like their B-sides have this grounded nature to them, even in their modern discography, so to say, like Leave or Cover Me or Blind Spot. Those feel like older Stray Kids songs, for example. But that being said, back to the original point is that I do feel like their older discography was them not being afraid of admitting to mistakes. And I like the fact that they reassure the audience that perfection is not possible. Songs like Grow Up highlight the fact that adults make mistakes all the time. You, as a young person, are not going to be invulnerable to that. You will make mistakes. And as you know, there's a slight theme on this channel. I don't think it's strong enough to be called a theme, but I suppose whatever works to get the message across that, I've made videos about making mistakes, and, I felt the need to be the definition of someone who is striving in perfection and not realizing that even if I wanted to, I could never be perfect, because your environment and the things that happen around you can sometimes lead you to go astray from that goal of perfection. And, we live in a world where there's a lot of puritanical thinking, where you can only think black and white, which leaves a dangerous lack of room for no nuance. And we need nuance to be able to critically think and to be able to not demonize or romanticize something to an extreme. It can create a lot of stress. It can lead to the idea of perfection turning it into like an obstacle, to the point where you're never going to be able to break down that wall. I think Stray Kids songs unknowingly, I don't know, because they wrote these songs so young, but I feel like they didn't know it at the time, but I do feel a lot more humanized by their songs, to the point where they do talk about flaws and they do talk about imperfections, and they kind of embrace how valuable a person is. Where I feel like, especially in today's culture, where the youth are heavily impacted by cancel culture and how it affects how some people act offline, to the point where it feels like if they make a mistake, even if no one's looking, they might get Twitter canceled. And, it's almost draining to think about the fact that cancel culture is such an enemy of good. like, don't let perfection be stopping you from reaching good. I've heard someone say that, and it's so important to realize that mistakes will happen, and one should not demonize oneself for making those mistakes, or else we'll never actually learn from what went wrong. Because if we demonize ourselves to such a point, we don't actually believe, or we won't have the self-esteem to be able to pick ourselves up and be able to forgive ourselves and make proper change. I want to look at 19, and the song is so interesting to me because it's a song that mourns one's childhood, knowing that when you turn 20, you're not going to be seen the way that you used to. Even though you're 18 or 19, I think adults still see you as a child because, well, you're just barely legal and you're pretty young. But the narrator is actively aware of the fact that they're growing up, but all these things that they are used to and what they have done as a kid almost makes it feel like the narrator is implying, or the narrator makes a claim that 19 is the last year of your childhood. To me, it feels like things are changing for the narrator, the way their parents view them, the way they used to view themselves, and how that will change once they turn 20. Even though they're worried about all these things in adulthood, it almost feels like they're trying to grasp their childhood one last time. Because there could be fear that they won't be looked lovingly as they were when they once were a child when they turned 20. And that is a fear that makes someone grieve something that they might never really get back. And I think 19 does a good job in capturing the fear of growing up, or wanting to grow up when you were younger, but now that the time has come, all that excitement has faded away. I think the song does a good job in capturing the hyper-awareness of how small you once were when you used to walk around the city, but now that you're an adult, it's almost like you've grown out of the city and everything feels at your level and you're able to tackle it all. Seeing your childhood slip away the day you turn 20 is oddly scary. Now, forgive me for mispronouncing this song's name, but Chronosaurus? I apologize. Anyway, this song talks about how time goes by so fast, and weirdly enough, I've noticed it too within my own life. I think we all do. Like, things go by so quickly, especially like things that you enjoy and love. Sometimes it's so quick that I lose my breath and I barely have enough time to recuperate to be able to think of the next step. I remember as a child that whenever summer break would roll around, 2 months used to be such a long time, but now it feels like nothing. I mean, it can really show how quick things go by, but also your perception as you grow up and how you perceive time becomes a lot more different, because the world around you is, as a child, is so much larger, but when you're older, you're able to peek over and be able to see its secrets. And I feel like this song is not about having enough time and the anxiety that comes with that, because sometimes we want to do things, but we just don't have enough time to do them. And when you're older, you tend to have a lot more responsibilities, and sometimes we get wound up in those responsibilities to such an extent that we don't hit pause and reflect. These examples of these songs I've just talked about, I feel like one thing that I've noticed in common is that Stray Kids doesn't really give you an answer to the anxieties of growing up. I think it makes sense for them because at the time they wrote these songs, they were going through this phase themselves. And I don't think not having an answer was uncomforting. I think it made it much more grounded. Expecting someone who was around your age at the time to have the answers to provide comfort can be challenging. And I think the reason why these songs are so comforting is because the members provide observations of how they view the world. And I think when you're entering a phase in your life, you're probably asking questions on what will this phase give to me? What will I face? And what challenges will I have to overcome? And sometimes you're thinking about the past too, and how, how would you reapproach certain things that happened in your past? I think this type of reflection may happen to some people. I mean, it happens to me. The amount of self-reflection that happens when you're at a transitional phase in your life can really make you anxious, and it might make you feel guilt, and it might make you feel regret. But I think one thing is important to remember, that what happened, and sometimes you don't know any better, and sometimes you're doing your best at that moment. And especially when you're growing up, to expect yourself to know something that maybe a 25-year-old would, I think that's silly. And I think that being able to own up to your mistakes, or knowing that something wasn't your fault, even though you probably were blamed for it, I think this type of self-reflection and understanding yourself can bring a lot more peace and potentially set you on a road for healing and being able to look at yourself with much more compassion. Because I think self-reflection is the truest marker of growth. And I think while talking about these 3 songs as, examples, I think even when the members look back into their childhood before they enter a new phase in their own lives, there's a sense of sadness, anxiety, and anger. I think the world prioritizes accomplishments to be done as young as possible. I mean, have we seen the amount of young prodigies and how widely they are praised? I mean, and with the world that always focuses on being productive, and as a society, we're quite hyper-capitalistic, at least in the West, I do feel like the guilt of not doing something young can be a genuine thing for some people, and to feel genuine guilt about it, even though the phase that they were in did not need that level of productivity or accomplishment, because whatever phase they were at, they were valid and justified in doing whatever they were doing, and not being this extraordinary, and sometimes to some people beyond human activity. I think we are told that productivity is the goal and maybe even our purpose. And even though our purpose is to be able to do things and to achieve things, I think our biggest purpose is to be well-rounded and to experience diversity. I think Stray Kids provides justification of feeling these feelings of negativity surrounding growing up, and along with the fact that we can see how these feelings can be reflective of how society has treated young people into thinking that their worth is defined by how much they contribute to society monetarily, rather than socially and emotionally. And Stray Kids makes me feel comfortable with sitting with these feelings and analyzing my fear of time running out while growing up, without having to be ashamed of feeling that I am not enough, or I haven't done enough during that previous phase of my own life. Once again, I know that these songs are not the only examples of Stray Kids having songs about growing up. However, I did want to do, I think I messed that sentence up grammatically, but we're gonna go with it. But I did want to do an analysis, a small analysis, on Stray Kids' songs before the God's Menu era. Because I feel like Stray Kids doesn't do concepts, or I know a big critique is that they don't do concept work properly, and I understand that critique, and that's very valid. But to me, I've always felt like the concept were the members themselves, where they're at in their lives. Like, I've always felt like, in a way, that their concept, you know, how many Western artists get personal with their work, and they write music based on their personal stories. And there's not really a concept per se. I mean, some of them do have a core aesthetic. I mean, when we say Sabrina Carpenter, we have images that come to mind, right? When it comes to Taylor Swift, like, we have images that come to mind. But I feel like Stray Kids, their concept work, I feel like their concept is their stories themselves. And, you know, I think that's what Stray Kids aims to do, but, you know, again, the critique of a lack of concept work is completely valid. And yes, that being said, that this video was not meant to be a video essay, but I think like a small reflection on how Stray Kids and their discography kind of work. And I feel like this video highlights a lot of their B-sides that don't really, especially in their earlier music, don't really get to see the light of day. And even though God's Menu is when they finally grew up, I mean, their earlier music is them growing up, but I think God's Menu is when they truly found their place, and they grew up literally in a mainstream sense, and like seeing how young the members were and how they were entering adulthood in that sense. And, you know, I think the journey of growing up is so important to study, to learn from, because sometimes it can give us peace and sometimes it can stress us out, but sometimes looking into our past can be really helpful, and sometimes it can be terrifying. And sometimes your childhood and your past can be the lullaby that brings you to sleep, but sometimes it can be the terror that keeps you awake and forces your hand to stay awake all night as a way to fight off the bad dreams. But sometimes it can be used to help one grow, but sometimes it can make one feel such shame. But I do know this. Everyone's self-reflection is nuanced, and especially when it comes to growing up, we all have one thing in common, is that we all grow up, but sometimes our experiences provide self-reflection in different ways, and they can give us different feelings. But I think one thing at the end of the tunnel, when we all grow up, is that self-reflection never really stops, and we always keep doing it. And somehow, maybe the self-reflection that brought us peace could one day give us stress and guilt, and the self-reflection that once terrified us can provide us peace. Life is ever-changing, and growing up can also feel that way too. And sometimes growing up can feel nerve-wracking and feel so breathtakingly overwhelming. But I think there's a beauty in having different people talk about how they view growing up, because at the end of the day, we all grow up.